Thank you very much. I'm humbled and honored to give the keynote address at this, the most important annual event for our Sydney Jewish community. First of all, I'd like to thank and acknowledge the President of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, Leslie Berger, and also Kirsty and the entire Berger family for all they have done for our community. As the descendant of a Holocaust survivor, Leslie knows well the duty on all of us to honour the millions of lives lost and to record their stories. And I want to thank Leslie for his leadership in this undertaking, and also to acknowledge the honorary officers, the directors, the life members of the Board of Deputies. I want to thank and commend the Chair of the Holocaust Remembrance Committee, Dane Stern, also Suzanne Green and all of the committee members for the devotion and energy they brought to this event. I'd like to acknowledge the many community leaders present this evening, including Gillian Siegel, AO, the President of the Executive Council of the Australian Jury, to welcome John Roth as well, Peter Wertheim, AM, and Robert Good, AOSC. I'd like to welcome the many members of the federal and state parliaments, councillors, ambassadors and consuls with us this evening and watching online throughout the country. And finally, but foremost, I wish to acknowledge the survivors of the Holocaust, the most esteemed and treasured members of our community, those who emerged from the greatest crime in history and enlighten our society with their dignity and their strength. What happened to the Jews of the Soviet Union during the Second World War is one of the least understood aspects of the history of the Holocaust. The crimes committed there were too vast, too swift, too brutal, too complete. They left few survivors to tell the story. They left no large camps or crematoria, edifices of human monstrosity that served to remind and to educate. For the most part, the very few who survived these crimes, the very many who committed them, and the Soviet authorities that failed to prevent them, were all satisfied to try to erase them from consciousness. But all throughout the once unknowable lands of the former Soviet territories lie killing fields, thousands of sites, many of them disturbed and desecrated, in city parks and forests and gentle valleys where entire communities of murdered Jews lie beneath. The extermination of the Soviet Jews took place under cover of the German invasion of the Soviet Union launched on the 22nd of June, 1941. Stalin had been caught completely unprepared, having long dismissed Churchill's warnings of ominous German troop movements and intelligence reports of a looming invasion as mere British agitation and warmongering. Stalin's purges in the 1930s of his finest generals and imprisonment of millions of Soviet citizens in the Siberian gulags had left the Red Army a pitiful husk, utterly incapable of defending its territory against the advance of the regular German army, the Wehrmacht. The invasion was the single largest military operation ever seen, involving some 3.8 million German and Axis troops. Within 3 weeks of its commencement, the Germans had captured territory twice the size of France. Within a month, the Soviets had lost 2 million men and seen the destruction of much of its officer corps. But this was an entirely different kind of war, one unprecedented in human history. Here, the primary aim was not territorial acquisition or a strategic victory, but the complete obliteration of the enemies of Nazism and what Hitler termed Judeo-Bolshevik influence. He promised this would be a battle of annihilation, a Rassenkampf, race war. In the months leading up to the invasion, the German High Command had to solve the problem of how to simultaneously conduct a conventional military campaign on an enormous scale requiring maximum force delivered with lightning speed while diverting men and resources for something which had no military imperative whatsoever, the pursuit and destruction of civilian communities in towns and cities and villages across thousands of miles of Soviet territory. By March 1941, it had been determined that special task forces would be deployed to implement collective measures against the Jews. They would receive their quarters and supplies from the German army, but they would pursue their own mission, taking their orders from the Chief of Security Police, Reinhard Heydrich. As the German army swallowed up enormous territory, bringing millions of Soviet citizens under its control, these special task forces moved fast on their heels, often even appearing on the front lines to trap the Jews before they could discover their fate. In Zhytomyr, they entered right behind the first German tanks. In Kiev, they entered on the same day that the city fell. Elite, mobile, and merciless, these special task forces, these killing squads, were known as Einsatzgruppen. The entire Einsatzgruppen consisted of a mere 3,000 men, broken into 4 divisions, Einsatzgruppe A, B, C, and D, each was attached to another group of the advancing German army, meaning they could fan out and cover enormous territory, from Odessa on the Black Sea in the south to Tallinn and Riga on the Baltic in the north. Their effectiveness came from their mobility, their freedom to peel off from the regular army, enter towns and villages to begin their hunt. After striking at a target, they would return to conduct further sweeps. Sometimes mere hours after the first, sometimes weeks would pass, but they would always return to ensnare any Jews who had evaded the initial dragnet. The precise methods of killing varied. In Dalnik, outside Odessa, Jews were crammed in warehouses and machine-gunned through holes in the walls and then set alight. In Zmievska Balka, outside Rostov, the Jewish men were led to a ravine and shot. The women, the children, the elderly were gassed in trucks and then deposited in the ravine. Jews were shot in forest pits they were forced to dig, in anti-tank trenches in which they were forced to lie, layer upon layer upon layer, the living lying atop the dead and wounded, awaiting the fire of the bullets from above. Sometimes the Germans would simply bury Jews alive to spare their bullets. The locals would report strange movements of the earth and groans from within for days after these massacres. On other occasions, the Germans would incite locals to club Jews to death or to burn them alive. In Bogdanovka, Jews were placed in stables, 5,000 sick and infirm Jews, which were then sprinkled with straw and set alight. 43,000 more were marched into the forest in groups of 300, forced to kneel naked in the ice and shot. The sheer speed of events, the lightning German advance, had left the Jews in a bewildered daze. Sometimes in the span of just a few hours, the Soviet forces would abandon a town or a city, the killing squads would enter, and the Jews would simply be plucked from an ordinary, peaceful civilian existence and taken to be executed despite having committed no crime. The Germans frequently noted a strange calmness among the Jews as they drifted in a dreamlike disbelief right up until the moment of death, their already meager capacity to resist overwhelming force neutralized by the deathly efficiency of the killers. In places like Riga, Vilnius, and Slonim, ghettos were established, so that those Jews deemed too valuable for the initial massacres, skilled Jewish workers, could be used as slave laborers until non-Jewish replacements could be trained. When it came time to liquidate a ghetto, a few Jews would be taken to dig mass graves outside the town in readiness for the slaughter. Now knowing what fate awaited them in the morning, a morbid communal dread set in, and the Jews would make final, feeble, futile appeals to the Germans. The killing operations would begin either at dawn or sometimes in the middle of the night. First, police units would encircle the ghetto. Then SS men and local collaborators would enter with flashlights, shouting for the Jews to open their doors. Those who submitted were assembled and led to the mass graves to be shot. Those who resisted or hid were burned alive or exploded with grenades. The sheer scale of this killing was enormous. Every day, the Einsatzgruppen would dutifully send reports to Central Command of 23,600 Jews shot in Kamenets-Podolsk, of 33,771 Jews shot in Kiev, of 35,000 in Nikolaev, and on it went day after day after day. But so small a force, with no knowledge of the land or the population, could not have killed on such a scale without considerable help. And in virtually every place it entered, these killing squads could count on the support of locals who knew the Jews and knew the hiding places. In the Ukraine, Latvia, and Lithuania, they formed auxiliary police units which assisted in every phase of the killing process, often carrying out the bloodiest work to spare the nerves of the Germans. The Romanian troops around Odessa frequently shocked the Germans with their brutality and their sadism, butchering Jews independently of Nazi orders. Ordinary civilians also seized the opportunity to plunder, brutalize, and murder their Jewish neighbors. In Kaunas, a young Lithuanian man bludgeoned Jews to death with a crowbar in front of a crowd that sung the national anthem and cheered every killing. In Latvia, university students assisted in the killing of Jews. In Proskudiv, Ukraine, the Ukrainians lined the streets and applauded as Jewish women were stripped and led to be shot. By the time the Germans were forced into a retreat, some 1.5 million Jews lay dead across Soviet lands. 90% of Lithuanian Jews were dead. In Latvia, just a few hundred Jews remained. Estonia had been declared completely free of Jews as early as 1942. In Belarus, 800,000 Jews were dead. The once storied black soil of the Ukraine now bulged disfigured from over 2,000 killing sites across its land. Babi Yar, a block from my own family's home, just one site, the most famous. But every town, every city, every village hosted its own Babi Yar, its own killing field. One of the reasons why the Soviet phase of the Holocaust is so often overlooked is that it fails to fit within many of the prevailing theories to emerge from the study of the Holocaust. That there was a phased, discernible progression from Nuremberg to Kristallnacht to the adoption of the final solution in Wannsee in January 1942. That there was a gradual process of dehumanization of evil words that led to evil deeds. That the insidious drip of Nazi propaganda slowly turned populations against their Jews, making them numb or complicit to their demise. But the extermination of the Jews had been operating in the Soviet territories for 6 months before Wannsee. In the Soviet Union, there was no careful process of defining and classifying Jews, of gradually expunging them from public life by confining them to ghettos until we resembled the insular, wretched, diseased species the propaganda said we were all along, and the locals now ached for our removal. In the Soviet Union, none of this was necessary. The locals had been primed into supporting anti-Jewish measures over centuries by the Cossacks of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, by the conspiracy theories spread by the Tsar's secret police, by the church, and by state-sanctioned pogroms. In the Soviet Union, the Jews could simply be summoned and shot with no opposition and no outcry. Who were the assassins of children and old women on the Eastern Front? Who were the men who filled the ranks of the Einsatzgruppen, who rode down dirt tracks and highways on motorbikes and in cars like merry adventurers entering new towns and villages, where they would attend to the shooting of 875 women and girls in Berdichev, or where they would kill 90 Jewish children in Bela Tserkva, that acted not only with a deathly precision, but a clear enthusiasm. In Minsk, they forced children into pits of quicksand and threw handfuls of sweets at them as they flailed in terror and perished. These were not young soldiers trained to kill on command or depraved criminals released from German jails and now let loose. Virtually all were educated men in their 30s and 40s. One of the earliest commanders of the Einsatzgruppen held a doctorate in jurisprudence. One of their officers was a physician. Many were lawyers. One was an opera singer. These were cultured men, deep thinkers who plainly knew the insanity of killing every single Jew as a Bolshevik agitator. They knew, and yet they carried out their work with a perfect efficiency, applied all of their talent and learning to it, and never wavered in their task. And so gone were entire communities, whole dynasties of sages and scholars and artists. Gone were the secluded families seeking wisdom in ancient texts. Gone were the middle-class merchants of the cities, the Jewish peasants tending the land, the poets, the bankers, the doctors, the vagrants, the drunks, the children, the old and the sick, all of them, all shot as mortal threats to German survival and human progress. In the final wash, it just didn't matter how absurd the idea of their collective guilt was. People believed this insanity because they wanted to believe it. And if they were wrong, and they had just extinguished millions of lives for no reason at all, and their misfortune would not go to the grave with a Jew, well, at least they'd blown off a little steam and enriched themselves in the process. The thousands of stories of trauma and suffering, the dozens of dispassionate historical texts, the Hollywood films, the memoirs, the novellas that depict these events, all seek and all fail to explain why human beings would behave this way to their fellow man. What discord exists in the hearts of ordinary men and women, that they would seize with unrelenting purpose the opportunity to dispossess, humiliate, and murder their neighbors simply because they were Jewish. This is the imponderable at the heart of the Holocaust. There is a story told by the scholar and Nazi hunter Efraim Zurov at the beginning of one of his books. He tells of Shimon Dubnov, who was a great writer and historian, and he was one of those Jews shot in the Riga ghetto. And as he was being led to be killed, he cried out his final instructions to those Jews around him. He said, Yidden, verschreibet, Jews, write it all down, record everything. Meanwhile, in Kovno, Lithuania, Jews there wrenched from their homes and taken to be shot, left their final instructions, which they'd scrawled on one of the walls. It said, Yidden, Nekoima, Jews, take revenge. I think about these words a lot, and I'm compelled in part to write and to speak about what happened to our people by the injunction of Shimon Dubnov, as painful as this history is to read and to write and to speak. But the revenge, a concept to which I'm particularly drawn, is more elusive. How does one avenge the most audacious, the largest, the most barbaric crime in human history? Really a sequence of millions upon millions of crimes rendered on the weak and defenseless by hundreds of thousands of individual perpetrators who for the most part face no justice or consequences at all. But when I think about what those crimes sought to achieve, which was the complete termination of Jewish life, so that we and our children should never have been born, by living as Jews, by bringing new Jewish life into this world, have we not taken our revenge? When the killers were forced into a retreat, they sought to erase any memory or evidence of their crimes, to deny that our people ever lived or died by hastily exhuming and burning the bodies. But we know, and we gather to educate and to remember. We dedicate new museums. We erect new monuments to our sacred dead, even right here in this great city. Have we not taken our revenge? And we should go on avenging daily through our survival, through our pride and our strength, and that will be our victory. Thank you very much.